Hi and welcome to Crime Tapes, a podcast made by Staffordshire University in association with the School of Law, Policing and Forensics. My name's Professor James Treadwell, and each week myself and Kyla Lawton are joined by a guest to debate a topic that's linked to crime. This week, for a special episode, we're going to be looking at crimes against humanity, and in particular, genocide and crimes against humanity that occurred in the context of the Yugoslav Wars. The Yugoslav Wars were a series of separate but interconnected conflicts and insurgencies that were fought in the former country of Yugoslavia between 1991 and 2001 at the breakup of what was then Yugoslavia. The country, previously a communist state run by a strongman lifetime president Tito, teetered on the brink as different regions and provinces essentially broke away. But subsequently, a conflict involving many of those former areas of Yugoslavia became increasingly bloody and brutal and gave rise to a genocide that now we remember even today, although perhaps not as much as genocides that have occurred in the context of the Second World War or in some other countries. The total deaths during the conflict are estimated to be up to around about 140,000, and 4 million people were displaced. The conflict gave us the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia and our recent and ongoing prosecution of crimes against humanity against some of those involved both in perpetrating directly and inspiring ideologically. A tribunal that only came to a close with the conviction of Ratko Mladic recently. Today our guest is Aida, who works with Staffordshire University and comes from Staffordshire's YMCA. Aida's own personal history is inexorably tied to the war in the Balkans, and in particular to Bosnia and Herzegovina, where she was living at the time that the war broke out in 1991. Now, the war in the former Yugoslavia is incredibly complex, and indeed, in some ways, it only really comes to an end in 2000. Although the war essentially in Bosnia and Herzegovina had ended after around about 3.5 years in 1995, when the United Nations intervenes and the signing of the Dayton Agreement. That brought to an end a 3.5-year Bosnian war, which were part of the Yugoslav Wars, but even as late as 2000 there was still conflict in Kosovo between Kosovans and Albanians, and in many ways the period of war in the former Yugoslavia is one of immense complexity, and that's why it's difficult to give simple overviews of what was happening. But it was the experiences of Bosnia and Herzegovina that our guest today experienced, and that's where we're going to be focusing.
So, hi Ada. I was roughly your age at the time. I was 16 in
1992.
1992, I was 16, and I was obviously living a very different life. I was more concerned of getting into clubs and other things that I shouldn't have been doing. So tell me what your experience of 1992 was.
Well, the thing is, I was 18 at the time, and I was pretty much just a normal teenager, like yourself, and just looking into clubbing and, that cute guy over there and how to, get his number, basically. And then suddenly I'm standing with my friends across the street, and we're just chatting and thinking, there's some rumors around and some kind of odd kind of feelings, and we heard there was some road blockades, and people couldn't really travel freely, and there were shortages in the shops as well, so you would have like one food product like across the 5 shelves, just like chestnut puree or something silly like that. That's something that I didn't even like. And suddenly there was a massive explosion, and this thing flew over our heads and fell towards the town center. And we just obviously kind of followed with our looks, and then we looked at each other, and then we heard the explosion. Because at first you just hear the kind of whistling sound. And we were like, okay, that's unusual. And then we didn't click, because if you don't expect the war, you don't see war until the second one kind of flew over our heads and exploded again in the town, and we just realized we have to run for safety. So basically, yes, it was pretty much overnight. The night before that, actually, I was in a school with a friend of mine, and we had afternoon school, so we finished about 6 o'clock. And we came to the town, and we were thinking, let's just go and get a coffee somewhere. And the town square was crowded with people. There was people everywhere. And you can hear again how worried they were. Like, you can just hear this murmur. And I'm just okay, we knew there was no celebration of any kind, kind of schedule or anything like that. So it was quite unusual. And we tried to kind of hear from people, what's going on. And then they said, well, we were given 30 minutes to leave our homes. They all came from a neighboring town, about half an hour drive from where I live. And then we could hear some shots, gunshots, some explosions in the distance. And again, because you don't expect war, you think, oh, this is just some misunderstanding, or this will kind of be okay by tomorrow. Later on, I realized, well, these people stayed there for 3 years. They couldn't go back home because all their homes were destroyed. And we just took them in, people of my hometown just took them in. So, yeah, not a really kind of regular, teenage years. But, of course, so, there's no electricity. So we were a bit different from, say, Sarajevo, which is our capital, which was shelled every single day. Because we were a vast area, so it didn't really kind of pay out to shell us every single day, because most of the shells would ended in the fields, So they were waiting for market days, for weddings, for funerals, and then they would just throw 1 or 2 shells, and that's when you had many casualties. And that's the worst thing, that being powerless as a civilian who didn't do anything wrong, and suddenly all these bad things happening to you.
And psychologically, a lot of what was happening in the former Yugoslavia, in the Balkans at the time, was almost a sort of form of psychological warfare as well.
Absolutely.
It was to very deliberately unsettle. But I think one of the things that people listening may not necessarily get as well, though, is that the people who are doing this were people in the army that had once been your national army.
Yes.
So this is these are people that you would have, if you'd gone on holiday to other parts of Yugoslavia, at one point you could have been chatting friendly, meeting them, be shared identity, and then very, very quickly, the people in the hills, off in the distance, who were shared nationality until, incredibly recently, are then the ones who are doing this. That must be hard to comprehend at any age, let alone your teen years.
But you also had, I have a cousin who was in the army at that time, serving as a conscript, And obviously, as a soldier, you're given the order to listen and obey, follow the orders. So at first, when he was stationed in Croatia, and when he was told to go out, to the trenches and do the trenches and actually fire some shots over in Croatia, he just did it because he didn't realize what he was doing until he realized what he was doing.
Yeah.
And then they all escaped. Yeah. Or most of them escaped, tried to anyway. Some got killed on the way. But that's the thing, we were all so close, and the thing was that also different people, you couldn't serve in Yugoslav army in the same republic. So if you came from Bosnia, you had to serve it somewhere else, like Slovenia or whatever. Yeah. So this connection or bond between nationalities was very, very strong. And it was beautiful as well because, there was mixed marriages, there was, friendships, godfathers all around.
And this is the thing that for me is the most striking in some ways, because it's when seen through a prism of the outsider, you don't necessarily understand that, because we're now looking back through a different sort of prism where you go, yeah, Bosnia and Herzegovina up here and it's majority Muslim, and here you have Serbia and that's different, and you've got Croatia, and up towards the top you've got Albania, and there's always, there's clearly been differences, and so because being from the outside and looking back through history, you just don't understand or comprehend this. But it really was a case of these are our own people, and that's where in some ways there's almost a shared element in lots and lots of crimes against humanity and genocide, in that they happen, but they also happen whereby the people that are perpetrating are our former friends, neighbours.
Yes.
It's that closeness,
colleagues.
that colleagues, it's that proximity.
That's why it's very difficult to understand. So I don't blame other people from abroad who don't understand it, because even for us, as you said, it was very difficult to understand. You feel betrayed, you feel scared, let down, and you still think, oh, maybe I'm just wrong, until, well, you just have to live in a shelter for 3 years,
And that is basically what happened to yourself, isn't it? I've been with you previously where you were describing the sort of progress, as it were, and I hate to use that word, but the progression is better, I suppose. The progression of the war, and it starts with some shortages, and you feel the effect, but it gets worse and worse and worse. So you get into winters without windows, and people living a lifestyle that it's pretty hard to comprehend was that encountered in Europe in the 1990s.
Yes, exactly. As I said, we were very normal, family, just like today. And yes, you'd have to. I admired, my mother, for instance, who could make a meal out of 2 ingredients. I couldn't do that, but they had to. You just kind of adjust. And then I did an assignment on university about women in First World War, and they were doing exactly the same thing. And I'm thinking, wait a second, is it 100 years later and we haven't learned a thing? It's just scary, absolutely scary. And again, even the German mothers were doing the same thing, and French mothers, and any other, in a conflict. So people sometimes forget that there are no rules in the war, and that's why we must avoid it at all costs. There's absolutely no rules.
Yeah, and the case of those no rules meant that what happened in the Balkans was utterly horrific, which is why we end up with the International Tribunal for Crimes Against Humanity in Yugoslavia, or the former Yugoslavia. But again, our listeners may not know very much about that, but it wasn't really a conventional war where you had soldiers fighting soldiers that you experienced for much of it, was it? It was very much sort of forces, militias, men taking areas and regions and then wreaking havoc while they were there.
Yeah. Well, Yugoslav army was, I think, 3rd or 5th in Europe by its power. So they had anything from ships to planes, and needless to say, they would fire surface-to-air missiles on civilians. When they did that, I thought, I'm dead, basically, and all of my town is gone. And that winter we all end up with no windows or window glass, and then you can't buy it because there's nowhere to buy it. So you just end up with a plastic over your windows. So it's just things that you could not think of. And yes, then there was poison gases, there was poisoning food as well. And actually, I was going through my war. It's not a war diary. It was actually just like a kind of teenage diary.
Yeah.
But I noticed that some things I did write down. Like if some of my friends would die, I would say how upset I was, and some of them it would be just briefly how they will be missed, and some more into depth. And I just found it last night. I said about one of my cousins being. Something like this sentence goes, oh yeah, by the way, Edin was hit by shrapnel today and a little bit gassed.
It's normal.
And I'm like, what? I cannot believe that even the language, even the thought process that I was using then was just so ridiculous. it's just scary, isn't it? So things like that, just sometimes. And then, for instance, there's one account that I thought I've never written about, and I was so cross with myself for about 20 years. And then one day, for one of the projects here in Stoke-on-Trent, I again went through my diary, and I found it. I found the whole account written down, and I was so happy, even though it was horrendous testimony about my very good friend dying, being injured or chopped to pieces by shrapnels alongside my brother. But to his sister and his mother, I offered that recording. I said, if you want it, I can give that to you. Because only literally a week before that, I introduced him to the sister of my best friend, because he was so in love with her. He was such an amazing guy. He was very intelligent, very polite, very handsome. He was dancing. He was a good mathematician. You just name it. He's just the best guy ever. And he was so in love with her. And she came to my place for coffee, or some concoction that we could kind of call coffee, because we didn't really have real coffee for a long time, And I rang him up. We could only have local lines at some point. And I rang him and said, she's here, do you want to come? Just, And there was no fuel, so there was no, I'm just going to sit in my car and just drive to you. He had a small motorcycle, and I don't even know how he found a bit of fuel to come quickly to my place. And then when he came, I was like, oh, hello. As if pure coincidence.
I just happened to be in the area.
Yes. But he was so happy. And then I was so happy that actually before he died, he was he had this, kind of wish kind of fulfilled. And that has made me appreciate life and all the small things, my friend. And that was the worst thing, actually. Never mind not having the food to eat. Never mind not having electricity for 3 years. So even today I walk in the darkness when I go at night to the toilet, or around the house. I just do. It's the loss of life. When you lose somebody, there's nothing that can, replenish that. And I just didn't want it upon anybody, So that was the worst thing, especially because, then people did nothing, absolutely nothing.
And it was a conflict where it was very often civilians who were absolutely in the front line that were the victims, and that's what we ought to remember about crimes like genocide and crimes against humanity. Although we start off in a way by talking about the war in the Balkans, the war in former Yugoslavia, and so on. In some ways, that terminology of war kind of conveys the idea of a fight between military forces, but what you're describing is simply not. And I suppose the event that people may have heard about, particularly from Bosnia and Herzegovina, where they may recognise that is Srebrenica and the Srebrenica massacre. Could you tell us a little bit about Srebrenica and why it's important that we remember it?
Yes. Well, Srebrenica is a small town in northeast of Bosnia, where over a span of 2 or 3 days, over 8,000 men and boys were executed. There's several mass graves there. Not several, there's actually dozens of mass graves there. Some are primary, some secondary, and some have remains of people dug up and reburied over and over again. Me being in the completely opposite part of the country at the time, I was in Northwest, I could only hear about Srebrenica on the radio. And we could sense by the tone of the journalist that it was alarming. Of course, they were warning even before that, and there was UN there, so we were kind of thinking, well, UN is there, so they're gonna kind of protect them, and it is,
Yeah, at the time, for people that don't know, it had been declared a UN safe haven.
Yes.
So the conflict had arrived at Srebrenica, where there's a majority sort of Bosniak population.
Yes.
But then the Serbian army also arrive, and alongside Serbian paramilitaries as well, because as people have been drawn into the conflict, well, on one hand you've got the sort of former military, you also had, particularly with some factions of Serbia, you had sort of paramilitary units that were formed up in some instances from groups like former football hooligans and former criminals taken out of prison in essence, and they then began to take take over villages and areas with essentially the people with power with them.
Yes.
Some of them very just brutal, nasty people. As you say, there are, in reality, we might think that there are rules in war, but there can just be nothing like it. It's enabling to the worst people in society. So Srebrenica is supposed to be being protected by the United Nations at the time, and there's a UN mission. By this point, Europe and the West knows what is going on in former Yugoslavia. It's featuring on the news, and Kyla and I would be watching that news, and I don't know about you, but I've known people who were involved in the military in the former Yugoslavia and sent on peacekeeping missions.
I did. I knew somebody.
But ultimately that went very, very badly wrong, even though all of the assurances were given that people were safe, in that essentially what happened is that the men and boys were separated from the women and taken off with... Yeah,
there were organised buses and trucks, literally, and people were loaded onto them.
And there was no intervention at this stage from the international security forces. Admittedly, they were small in number, and we could probably do a programme in and of itself on why this happened. I remember interviewing a guy who'd ended up in prison, actually, after he'd served in the British Armed Forces, and he had been in the former Yugoslavia, and he was describing to me that as being the slide in his mental health, because there were situations where he knew he was prohibited from intervening, where he knew people were going to die, and he was like, this is not what I signed up for. And he was a corporal, and you'd get a staff sergeant saying to you, you've been told what you're allowed to do. You do nothing. You do nothing, knowing full well that people were going to be dragged off and killed by that non-intervention. So, but ultimately what happens is that those men and boys are loaded onto buses purely because they are Muslim and they live in the wrong place, and they're driven out into fields and barns and shot en masse. Yes. And butchered. And the scale of that, as you say, is over 8,000 victims.
Yes, 8,372 is kind of official number, but then it has 3 dots behind that, because nobody will probably ever find out the exact number. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's all the more sort of shocking and horrific about it is, in some ways, is there are sort of scenes even now of men and boys being sort of wrenched away from women and girls, and it was that sort of separated and and people thought that they were safe. They ultimately thought...
Yes, well, there were filmed reassurances. General Ratko Mladic was saying, oh, don't worry, they'll be safe. You know, we just need to separate you, basically. And any boy, like age 13, or anybody that looked kind of older... in
11 and 10 in some cases.
So some mothers have managed to save some, putting them female clothes, you know. Yeah. But in general, all of them were... simply never to be seen again.
Now, in hindsight, it's regarded as one of the sort of bloodiest stains on the history of the United Nations. It is regarded as a kind of complete and utter failure. But it's always very easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to say this should have happened. And the thing is, at the time, it simply didn't, for various reasons.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a good point. The fact of the matter is, with anything like this, people do follow orders.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? You can't have... My criticisms, because obviously I criticise establishments, my criticisms are never with individuals. It's with the establishments, because people we follow orders.
A military hierarchy school you in following orders. And it's not about...
Yeah, and you're schooled in it, and not just that. I mean, if say, for example, if I was in that situation and I was told to do something that was against my principles, me turning around saying, I'm not doing that, I'll be the one shot.
I think what we see time and time again in some ways, and it also explains how in part genocides happen as well, is people can be very, very obedient to authority. There's a lot of sort of history of showing that people tend not to question and tend to...
Well, of course, because even in this genocide, you had people who would slaughter, like they would be slaughtering people like for like 8 hours straight.
Yeah.
And then only when they would be tired, they would say, I'm tired now, I'm just gonna so that guy who was just supposed to be slaughtered, is actually saved for possibly an hour or so until this guy has arrest.
Yeah.
So how do you justify that? You know what I mean? So
exactly.
it's really madness. That's what I'm saying. There's actually no rules in war, and it's just horrible thing.
Absolutely, and yet at the same time, one of the things that also happens is that there is in some ways a removal of those that give the orders and the instructions from the worst excesses of that happening.
Yeah, they're set out.
So if you look at those who are being indicted, although some are very heavily involved in, as you said, the actual act of killing and doing some horrendous and evil things, it is also of those indictments, and a large number of them are essentially politicians who are the enablers. They're the ones who give the orders, and in some ways they're the more protected ones, because it's very, very difficult. Even when we take Mladic, for example, his defence against his indictment on crimes against humanity is, no, I didn't tell anyone to do any ethnic cleansing. This is not something that I'm down with. This is individuals going off and doing their own thing. That's a very simplified version of the defence, but it is essentially the defence that the sort of political elites at the higher end of the social strata.
But the thing is, they're the ones that further the sort of ideologies that lead to that. I mean, you've only got to look at, I know this is in this country and it hasn't led to genocide. You only look at David Cameron when he said that swarms of immigrants were coming over here. Who likens people to a swarm of anything? Do you know what I mean? Swarm is scary.
That's the thing. Language is very dangerous.
Very dangerous.
Absolutely,
and on all sides, in the former Yugoslavia, there had been that sort of what had once made Yugoslavia, as you say, a country that was closely united. It was indeed those differences that were played upon as to divide people in that sort of political language of, they're trying. Look at them over there. They're not like
it's them and us.
The othering, the dehumanisation,
and that othering and dehumanisation is one of the sort of key sequential steps that take people on that pathway. If you remove people,
that's the most scariest and dangerous thing. If you remove people's humanity, then you can do what you want to them.
Absolutely. I think that point's a really, really good one, and it's a really good one, Carla, because we are marking today International Human Rights Day, and we often hear about human rights being sort of problematic, being difficult, human rights legislation being abstract. There's all sorts of
out of date,
barrier
to trade,
and there's a sort of tabloid take on human rights. Well, criminals are abusing our soft touch human rights again to get compensation for being injured in prison. Human rights in schools are stopping children playing conkers. There's so much nonsense that's taught very, very often that comes from a sort of fundamental lack of understanding. But what certainly we do know about human rights is that in the aftermath to the war in the Balkans, it was human rights related legislation that was pretty important in bringing people to justice under the International Criminal Tribunal, which again people may not necessarily know all that much about, and I don't want to talk too much about that, but just to sort of conclude really what happened in Yugoslavia, around about 164 people, I think it was, are indicted for crimes against humanity of various types in Yugoslavia, including those involved in Srebrenica. Indeed, I think Mladic was the last person to be convicted by the International Tribunal at The Hague. They're then jailed, so for various crimes perpetrated during the conflict. They end up with custodial sentences, in some cases, in Mladic's case, for life. So ultimately, although in some ways nothing can rebalance the harms that those people do, there is at least some attempt to mark out societal condemnation of their actions and to deliver some form of
some
punishment.
did apologize, some admitted, which I thought was, it's the right thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the least you can do to all the mothers and families, you know.
Absolutely, and but it's still, in some ways, it's still a difficult one, because I'm also reminded of the fact that, and again, it's sort of contentious, but even to use the term genocide, there was a sort of UN debate about the term genocide being applied, and it was vetoed by some states who were supportive of the Serbian cause in particular. Russia didn't like the use of genocide, so there are all those complexities, but at least human rights generally gives us a recognition of the fact that you can commit crimes against humanity. Some people, as you know, apologised. You do have to have some way of marking, the worst excesses of crimes that people can commit. But where, in terms of there is another set of value, a more everyday value that goes alongside those human stories, is actually really after the worst crimes, we often say never again. This should never be allowed to happen again, and yet what often happens is all
again.
Too quickly we forget what's happened, be it, as we say, whether we're talking about Rwanda or former Yugoslavia, or we do allow these exactly the same processes to play out again. But there is a value in using those experiences for education, isn't there? And that's certainly something that you do with the YMCA in Staffordshire, and it's something I think is just utterly brilliant. So Aida, can you tell us a little bit about that, and how you use, in particular, Srebrenica to educate people in Stoke-on-Trent?
Yes, well, about 6 years ago, I got introduced to the charity called Remembering Srebrenica, which I was pretty amazed by. They are stationed in Birmingham, and they're all British, basically. So I thought there would be some Bosnians there, but actually I was amazed that actually there weren't any. So this is an organization that has already set up this Lessons from Srebrenica trip. And basically, because I met them and I'm on the West Midlands board, then I asked them if I could send young people from YMCA, where I work here in Stoke, and see if we could kind of combine the two. And we've been doing it for the last 3 years. We organized 3 delegations already, and I still think the best way is for them to go and see for themselves, because I can tell people what I've been through, but I still think when you go there, see the buildings, as you said, and I think that was probably what did it for you as well, that interaction with the people who have lost, 35 immediate members of their family and have nothing but graves now, like some mothers in Srebrenica. So we've been doing these trips to the point that we try to kind of extend it to the whole of the Stoke-on-Trent. So not anymore we only send young people from YMCA, but we try to pair them up with people from community of various background, somebody they could look up to as well, and think, okay, I may be kind of on the rough now, but these people are just like anybody else, and they still succeeded. So hopefully that will kind of be a lesson as well. To see what they can accomplish. And I must say, as I said, we've been also organizing memorials, Srebrenica memorials, for the last 5 years here at the YMCA. We even built a small memorial, which I was very, very impressed with. We incorporated photographs from the first trip with the young people there. And I must say that even today, so 3 years later, I'm a very good friend with all of them who went. Their lives have changed tremendously. A lot of them, they want to come back and make a difference. They want to go into education. They want to get a job. Some want to be lawyers because they're appalled by some minor sentencing of some of the war criminals. And you just see this passion for life, and I know they had it rough sometimes, but when they come back, they are so full of energy and they still want to do something, that I always then try to take them around, and just seeing that. So even if they go back to their families, and become friends, or befriend them again, because most of them are just kind of estranged, to me that's a success.
Yeah.
Because when they see that them families are destroyed forever, because and there's no way they can repair it because these people are gone, then to me that's a success.
every year now at the YMCA, there's you put on a Remembering Srebrenica event. I'd encourage people, if they're around Stoke-on-Trent
in July,
to attend it. Last year I was honoured to be invited to come and say a few things as well, because I'm really concerned about this sort of rise of othering that goes on, particularly at times around our politics at the moment, and the way that we sort of forget what we have in common. But that event for me was really marked out this year, because you did something. It seemed so innocuous at the start. I don't want to give too much away, but it was incredibly powerful. It was a masterful piece of teaching. I wish I'd got something quite so good in my repertoire. But if I just say white armbands to you, could you tell our listeners a bit about what you did?
Yes. Well, this year I wanted to honour people of Prijedor. So on this year's memorial, I've asked not everybody, just some people, to wear a piece of white cloth, which kind of looks like a white armband. And I didn't explain them. I intentionally didn't explain them why. I just asked them, would you mind wearing this? And of course people agreed, because they didn't think anything much of it. Halfway through my speech, I asked then if those with armbands could just kind of stand up to kind of single them out, basically, from the crowd. And when they did, I said, well, you see, can you imagine that now all these people with the white armbands are literally identified as non-Serbs and therefore taken to concentration camps and killed? What would you think?
That's quite harrowing, isn't it?
And it was particularly harrowing when you were there, because
well, actually, you had a white armband.
I was wearing one, but you suddenly recognised that and you'd handed them out brilliantly, because it was just such a kind of complete and random selection of people, but a sizable proportion of the audience, sizable enough to make you realise that this is actually how it had happened. If you scale this across, it's just shocking. Yeah,
I think it brings it home to people, because I think what happens is in these situations is whenever there's a genocide, or my students, I run a module called the Anthropology of Evil, and we looked at serial killers, and I did a thing this week where I split the room up. I asked one side of the room to shout out as many serial killers that they knew, and they were like loads of them. Then I asked the other side of the room, shout out any victims of serial killers, and the room was silent. We forget the victims all the time. It's like they don't exist. They become just like an extra in a film, just that person who was getting coffee in the corner, and we forget the victims, because it's like with that lack of humanity of those people. Even when we give that humanity back and say these were humans, we forget who they are. I mean, obviously, we can't turn around and now say this person, that person, but we do forget that there are victims, and these are actual people with actual lives. And in somewhere like in the former Yugoslavia, I don't think there's many families that haven't been affected by this, is there? Oh,
no, not at all. Not at all. No, there's literally everybody. Yeah. Some obviously more than the others, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it's that, and again, it's that's why when it comes to educating students and giving them that education, that be it the students that you take from Staffordshire or just generally, that it's very, in some ways, it's very easy for things like genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity to become very sort of abstract, non-related to me concepts. They read textbooks. It becomes very sort of dry. Yes. But actually, it is about real people, real stories, real lives, real lives cut short in a massive way.
Or rape or ethnic cleansing, and the things that have been done and people have gone through, and
there's massive massive harm, even if you didn't experience anything through that, like that. Like you said, the hardship that people live through, the fear, the effect on people's mental health.
Yes.
Well, and you sort of
so much harm.
You also said, and it's the interrelated and interconnected way these things play out. For example, as well, Carla, because you said earlier on about the sort of the discussion of Cameron and the swarm of immigrants, and before that we've had a sort of May's hostile environment, but we've largely had a sort of hostility towards immigration written into the UK's political scene now, way back into the 1990s. And I certainly remember, for example, I remember that tension being stoked a little bit, even when it came to the former Yugoslavia, where people arrived in Birmingham who essentially had been made homeless by the war. It's one of the reasons why remembering the community is based in Birmingham. And yet, when you were saying, this sort of this swarm that Cameron describes, actually, when he was using that term, we again had genocide on the doorstep of Europe, and people were fleeing essentially all sorts of inhumane killers who would wipe them out. It's a question of who wouldn't act in that way if you're in that situation.
And also, if you look into these refugees' lives today, they are very upstanding citizens, aren't they? And they've done amazing things for this country. Because I think most of them just want to get back. Even I, who haven't had anybody, like if I meet in Stoke, and I have met some people who said, "Oh, I've driven a humanitarian convoy in Bosnia," I shake their hand. I say, "Can I please shake your hand? Thank you so much." Even it's been like so many years later, because to me, that's amazing. And I'm advising this person who helped my country at one point, how they lead their life. You know what I mean? It's just incredible how life can go around. It doesn't take much for things to turn around, don't they?
Well, absolutely.
We can still be humans about.
If you think about the people of Syria, they were living again in a peaceful, settled, the most progressive country in some would say in the Middle East at the time, and yet overnight that can very, very quickly change. And again, as you say, when you listen to the human stories behind the headlines of these immigrants, we are also talking about doctors, radiographers, teachers, educators, and you can lose that person in amongst the story.
In the stereotype.
It becomes a sort of the stereotype becomes, everybody coming towards us is out to exploit, whereas actually we part of our shared humanities, we have obligations to people in certain circumstances, and we're very bad at
I think it doesn't matter where you come from, what your background is, you all just want to do the same thing. You want to get through life. You want to make your way. If you've got family, you want to make sure they're all right. You want a basic roof over your head, or
for the vast majority,
that is what people will just.
For the vast majority of people caught up in conflict, that is exactly that's exactly what it is like. They're not the ones sort of at the top telling others what to do. They're not the ones perpetrating the atrocities. Most are simply trying to get by, with the shared humanity, and they are the people who pay the real costs as well. Very often, and again, I think that's why the human stories are so important in bringing that back into focus, because it is that old thing of there but for the grace of God in many ways.
But we really don't think it could happen to us over here, and we would react differently, and we would do it this way, and it's that same sort of, but I would stay and fight, and it's like, no, you wouldn't.
No. One of the things that's shown time and time again is actually that very few people actually would stand up and be counted. In some ways, what happens is that the vast majority don't. They are swept along with the circumstances that they find themselves taken by, and it's a myth to sort of suggest anything other than that. It's a myth that also lets the powerful off the hook.
Of course,
I think.
It does.
So I've been into Sarajevo myself, and for me, one of the things that really struck me was and I know you take the young people there as well, they're going into the Museum of Crimes Against Humanity, and you go in, and you walk from these streets that are beautiful. I mean, no other way of describing Sarajevo as a city. It is just the most fantastic city, absolutely, utterly beautiful. And you walk into the museum, and you suddenly become aware of the streets that you've walked on. You're being shown footage and pictures of just a few years previously, and it's on those streets that you're seeing people dying, you're seeing the bodies, that you're seeing the horrors, and it really is quite jarring, because it is so contemporary, and then that, I think, begins to start that process, as you say, of sort of changing the way that you think about things a little bit, and that, I think, tremendously powerful with young people, but also many of them having never heard of Srebrenica.
They're not even alive.
Go there, see the scale of 8,000 graves, and are meeting mothers and sisters of people who were killed in the massacre, who will tell the stories of those lost lives, and it, as you say, it changes their view. They're far less likely then to sort of do that othering themselves,
or even reading about it, or researching or whatever. But the thing is, like, I think it is how stoic and how wonderful their mothers are, regardless of their loss. Their demeanor is so. I'm so proud of them. I don't know if I would be able to be that. I don't know what's proper word in English, to be honest with you. Considering they're not shouting around, they're not, they just want justice. They just want justice, and they want the remains of their loved ones, to bury them and kind of have that closure. One mother said when we were there, she said, because one of my delegates asked her, "How do you get up every day?" Because she lost a son and a husband, and she said, "I lay with tears and I wake up in pain every single night." So, and then even so, that they just want justice. They're very, very determined. They followed every single rule. They made sure that, because actually Srebrenica now is ruled by the Serb authorities. So the fact that they're not even, they're still kind of. They don't feel welcome there, because even today they will walk on the same streets where some of the war criminals are still walking. Actually, when we were there this last time, we were sitting outside because the day was absolutely gorgeous, and I said, "Shall we sit on this terrace?" And we saw a police car driving by for about 4 or 5 times in this 2 hours, and they never smiled at us or anything. They were just like literally considering us as an enemy. It was a quite hostile kind of demeanor. Instead of them just jumping out, saying, "Hello, how are you? Who are you?" and all this, they could have easily had spoken to us. I would be the first one to approach them. But this type of intimidation happens today as well, and for them to still, despite all of that, preserve that, I don't know, just. It's not just sort of a simple forgiveness. There's a willingness there to kind of to use those experiences for betterment as well. And I think when they connect with young people in particular, you really do see the impact of that. You see the value. Because she said for one of them, "You're just like my son," and she was trying to feed him. Like, "Here's some coffee, here's some apples, take some apples," from her tree just there.
And that's the brilliant point of it, isn't it? Because actually, if you start to recognise you're just like my son, there's a shared humanity there. That's what guards against, and that's essentially fundamentally what fundamental human rights are. The right to they're about recognising each of us as having a shared humanity. That means that you don't do terrible things to people, because we are all one and the same human beings, because we bleed red. And that's where it really comes alive in some ways. That's where we can use
it's also important to recognise that even though some of us, all of us, should have human rights, not everybody can access those human rights.
No.
Even in a country where you have got fundamental human rights, not everybody can access them. And people still live in, like you said, in the situation where they feel they're not welcome in their own home. That is their own home. That is the only home they've ever known, and they don't feel welcome there. And we have the same problem happening more and more in this country.
Yeah, and I think that's the real danger as well of those divisive rhetorics, and that's where I'm particularly concerned at the moment in the United Kingdom, in that that sort of division is being sown more and more and more, whereby rather than recognising the sort of shared nature of what we have in common, it's very, very often about using and exploiting people, exploiting very often for their own advantage, the differences between people.
It's easier to get people to punch this way than it is to punch up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Every single way.
Absolutely. And so I think really in some ways that's why remembering is such a powerful vehicle, and I mean, I've been privileged to be involved. I do think it is tremendously powerful, and coming across young people who say this has fundamentally changed my view of the world. We rarely get that success in education. We try, but we rarely get it. But I don't think I've met a young person involved through the YMCA.
Well, the thing is, like, I have a waiting list now. Like, they want to go, and I keep telling them, I try to tell them it's not easy. It's not the usual residential we have for our young people, that you just go and visit some museums, have fun, have some wonderful food, which we do. We still try to kind of experience the culture of Bosnia and see the beauty of it, and meet some people, and I try to expose them to as many quirky little things as possible, and they love the food and everything, but I keep telling them, like, this won't be easy, but I said, if you're willing to learn as much as you can from it, no matter how little or how small, I think it will benefit you, and I haven't been wrong so far. They've been all absolutely amazing, and as I said, I have a waiting list, which I'm super chuffed about.
I think it's brilliant, and I think it's really important that we continue to remember that just a few years back this was happening in Europe, right on our doorstep. I remember meeting someone who said when I was in Bosnia and Herzegovina in a bar, who was saying, but you've got to remember, we were constantly being told it will never happen here. It could never happen here. Yeah. This is Yugoslavia. It could never happen here, and it's exactly that same message, I think, that comes out very often, that leads to a sort of complacency around, nothing could never happen here.
Yeah.
It's never. Yeah. Whereas the reality is, we woke up one day and it happened. Yeah. Was what he said to me, and I think that's why we've got to learn from things. I think it's why International Human Rights Day is massively important, and people need to educate themselves beyond the sort of tabloid rhetoric of this is all bad. You joining us, Aida, has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it was really nice talking to you.
Crime Tapes couldn't happen without the remarkable students and staff in the Staffordshire University School of Law, Policing and Forensics. Don't forget, UCAS deadline day is getting closer, and for those of you who want to pursue a career in crime prevention and investigation, decision time is getting closer. Make sure you research your future course and find out as much as you can before you start your journey.